Michael Rivera was born on June 14, 2002, in a small suburban town outside of San Antonio, Texas. The Rivera family was known in their community for their strict religious values. His father, Daniel Rivera, worked as a deacon at the local church, while his mother, Elena Rivera, was deeply involved in church activities, leading Bible study groups and volunteering every Sunday. For the Riveras, faith was not just a part of life, it was the very framework that dictated every decision, every rule, and every expectation inside their household. From the outside, their home looked ordinary, a modest two-story brick house on the corner of a quiet neighborhood street. But inside, life was anything but ordinary for Michael. He grew up surrounded by rigid schedules and uncompromising expectations. His daily routine revolved around church, school, and household chores. Unlike many of his classmates who had the freedom to explore hobbies, sports, or friendships, Michael's world was tightly controlled. Every morning began with prayer at the family dining table, every evening ended with scripture reading, and weekends were devoted entirely to church services and community obligations. Michael often felt suffocated by the intensity of his parents' devotion. While they viewed their rules as guidance toward a righteous life, to him, it felt more like a prison. Simple activities that most teenagers enjoyed, going to the movies, hanging out with friends after school, listening to music that wasn't religious, were strictly forbidden. His parents believed that the outside world was full of temptation, and their duty was to protect their son from its dangers. But what they saw as protection, Michael experienced as isolation. Throughout his teenage years, Michael struggled quietly with resentment. At Jefferson High School, classmates noticed how distant he often seemed. He was polite, soft-spoken, and never caused trouble in class, but he rarely engaged in conversations beyond what was necessary. Teachers described him as intelligent but withdrawn, someone who seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders. While other students shared stories of parties, sports events, or weekend trips, Michael often sat in silence, listening but never contributing. At home, the situation was even more intense. His parents constantly reminded him of his responsibilities as the only child. They expected him to follow in his father's footsteps in the church and to dedicate his life to ministry work. For Michael, this expectation felt like a sentence already written for him, leaving no room for his own dreams or choices. He quietly longed for independence, for the freedom to decide who he wanted to be. But in the Rivera household, questioning authority or challenging rules was not tolerated. As Michael grew older, the tension inside the family deepened. By the time he turned 19 in the summer of 2021, arguments had become a nightly occurrence. Small disagreements, about school, work, or even the music he secretly listened to when no one was watching, would spiral into heated confrontations. His parents, guided by their unwavering faith, believed discipline was an act of love. But for Michael, it was a constant reminder that he had no control over his own life. Behind closed doors, his anger began to grow. What started as frustration turned into bitterness, and what once felt like a burden slowly transformed into rage. Neighbors who occasionally saw the family at church or in their yard never suspected what was happening inside. To them, the Riveras were a respectable, God-fearing family living an ordinary suburban life. But beneath the surface, a storm was quietly building inside Michael, a storm that, within a matter of months, would erupt into unthinkable violence. By the beginning of September 2021, the Riveras' home in San Antonio had become a place of near-constant tension. Michael Rivera, now 19, was legally an adult, but inside his parents' house he still lived under the same rules he had known since childhood. He wasn't allowed to stay out late, wasn't permitted to choose his own friends without his parents' approval, and was constantly reminded that his future must align with the church. The pressure of these expectations grew heavier after his high school graduation earlier that year. While many of his peers moved on to college or full-time jobs, Michael's parents expected him to attend a local Bible college and eventually become a youth minister. Michael, however, had no desire to follow that path. He dreamed of moving to Austin, exploring art and music, and carving out a life that was his own. But whenever he voiced even the smallest wish to pursue something outside of their religious framework, his parents quickly shut him down. Michael's frustration wasn't only about college or career choices. It was about the lack of independence in every corner of his life. His parents monitored his phone, restricted his internet access, and discouraged him from making friends with classmates they considered worldly. They reminded him daily that obedience was a form of faithfulness and that questioning their authority was equivalent to questioning God. Michael began to feel that no matter what he did, he would never have a voice or identity of his own. The arguments inside the Rivera household became increasingly intense throughout late summer. What began as small disagreements, over chores, over curfews, over grades, often escalated into loud confrontations that echoed through the quiet neighborhood streets. Neighbors sometimes heard raised voices through open windows at night but dismissed it as the kind of family disputes that happen in every home. Nobody could imagine the depth of hostility that was building within Michael. On September 12, 2021, just after his 19th birthday, Michael had one of the most heated confrontations yet with his father. The argument started over his refusal to attend evening Bible study, but it quickly grew personal. His father accused him of being ungrateful and rebellious, warning that if he continued down this path, he would lose everything that matters. Michael, exhausted by years of being silenced, finally shouted back that he was tired of living a life that wasn't his own. The words hung heavy in the air, shocking both parents who rarely saw their son raise his voice. For Michael, however, it was a moment of release, though not enough to change anything. That night, after slamming his bedroom door shut, Michael sat in the darkness of his room, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were tangled with anger and despair. He wanted freedom but felt trapped. He wanted respect but felt invisible. The more he thought about his life, the more he believed escape was impossible unless something drastic happened. He began withdrawing even more, spending long hours alone in his room, often avoiding eye contact with his parents. By the following weeks, the atmosphere in the Rivera home was unbearable. His mother, Elena, tried to smooth over the constant tension with patience and scripture, but her words often sounded like lectures rather than comfort. His father, Daniel, grew stricter, doubling down on discipline in hopes of bringing Michael back to the right path. Instead, it only widened the gap. Each day, Michael's resentment grew, festering into something darker. Friends and classmates who occasionally saw him noticed subtle changes. A few recalled that he seemed quieter than usual, sometimes staring blankly as if lost in thought. He no longer smiled easily, and when asked about his future plans, he gave vague answers or quickly changed the subject. To outsiders, it looked like the normal struggles of a young man under pressure. But inside Michael's mind, a much more dangerous narrative was taking shape. The turning point came in the last week of October 2021, when Michael overheard his parents discussing plans to enroll him in Bible college without asking his opinion. That evening, they told him directly that applications had already been filled out and deadlines were approaching. They presented it as a decision already made for him, insisting it was the best path for his life. For Michael, it was the final straw. He felt not just unheard, but erased. That night, he sat alone in the basement, staring at the concrete floor, his thoughts spiraling. The basement had always been a place he avoided, cold, dimly lit, and filled with storage boxes. But now it became the backdrop for his darkest ideas. He imagined what life would be like if he were finally free of the suffocating control that dominated every moment of his existence. He began to think about his parents not as protectors but as obstacles, barriers standing in the way of his freedom. And for the first time he let the thought cross his mind, what if they were gone? This idea, though shocking at first, refused to leave. Over the next several days it followed him everywhere. At school, at the dinner table, even in his dreams. His anger twisted into dangerous determination. By early November, Michael's relationship with his parents was hanging by a thread, but no one around him could see how close that thread was to snapping. The Riveras still believed their son's struggles were temporary, just the normal rebellion of a teenager who would eventually return to the path of faith. What they didn't know was that Michael was already imagining a future without them in it. On the night of November 6, 2021, a cold front swept through San Antonio, Texas, bringing with it heavy winds that rattled the trees and a chill that seeped into the Rivera home. Inside the brick house on Oakwood Lane, the Riveras followed their usual Saturday evening routine. After dinner, Michael's mother, Elena, sat at the kitchen table reading her worn leather Bible, while his father, Daniel, prepared notes for Sunday service at the church. Michael sat in silence, his plate untouched, staring at the flickering light above the dining room table. The day had already been tense. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel had confronted his son about skipping chores and spending too much time alone in his room. The argument quickly escalated. Michael insisted he needed space, but his father accused him of being lazy and ungrateful. Elena tried to intervene, but her attempts to calm the situation only fueled Michael's anger. He stormed off to his room, slamming the door with such force that a picture frame in the hallway rattled against the wall. By evening, the household was quiet again, but the air was heavy with unspoken words. Michael sat on the edge of his bed, headphones in his ears, listening to music he knew his parents would disapprove of. Each song only amplified his feelings of rebellion and resentment. He thought about the conversation he had overheard a week earlier. His parents' decision to enroll him in Bible college without his consent. The anger from that moment still burned inside him. He felt like a puppet with strings being pulled at every turn. As the night wore on, Michael's thoughts turned darker. He walked quietly down to the basement, pretending to grab a box of old winter clothes. But in truth, he went there for another reason. In a corner of the basement, on a rusted metal shelf, lay an old toolbox his father used for small repairs around the house. Inside, among wrenches and screwdrivers, was a heavy claw hammer. Michael picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hand. The cold metal handle pressed against his palm, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at it. The idea that had been haunting him for weeks, removing the obstacle of his parents, suddenly felt like a plan within reach. The hammer was real, tangible, and in his grip, it seemed to hold a twisted promise of freedom. He put it back quickly when he heard footsteps above, his heart pounding as if he had already been caught. But the thought lingered, and once it entered his mind, it refused to leave. That night, as the clock struck 11:45 p.m., Daniel and Elena retired to their bedroom. Michael, however, remained awake. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his fists clenched. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, whistling through the cracks of the old house. To him, it felt as though the world itself was urging him forward, pushing him toward a decision he had been resisting for too long. At 12:10 a.m., Michael quietly got out of bed. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved carefully through the hallway. He paused outside his parents' room, listening to the faint rhythm of their breathing. His heart raced, but his mind was strangely calm, as though everything had been decided long before this moment. Slowly he descended into the basement once again. This time he didn't hesitate. He opened the toolbox and gripped the hammer tightly, the weight of it solid and final in his hands. For several minutes, Michael stood in the dark basement, the hammer dangling at his side. His breathing was shallow, his mind replaying every argument, every shouted command, every lecture that had left him feeling powerless. He thought about his future, the one his parents had scripted for him, and realized he no longer wanted to live under their control. His rage and desperation had fused into something unrecognizable, something violent. At 12:35 a.m. he crept back upstairs. The hallway was silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of a street lamp outside. Pushing open the door to his parents' bedroom, Michael stepped inside. He could see their outlines under the blankets, their breathing slow and even. For a moment he hesitated, his grip tightening on the hammer. A part of him screamed to stop, to put it down and walk away. But another part, the part fueled by years of pent-up anger, pushed him forward. The first blow landed with a sickening crack. Daniel stirred, trying to rise, but Michael struck again, his movements quick and frantic. Elena awoke in horror, her scream piercing the stillness of the night, but she too was silenced by the violent swing of the hammer. Within minutes, the room was filled with chaos, then silence. The only sound left was Michael's heavy breathing and the pounding of his heart. Afterward, Michael stood motionless, staring at what he had done. His hands shook, but his face remained expressionless. It was as if he had stepped outside of himself, watching the scene from a distance. He dragged both of his parents' bodies, one at a time, down the narrow staircase into the basement. The effort was exhausting, his body trembling with adrenaline, but he pushed through. By 1:15 a.m., both Daniel and Elena lay lifeless on the cold concrete floor of the basement, hidden from the world above. Michael covered them with old blankets and plastic tarps he found among the storage boxes. The basement, once just a place for tools and forgotten belongings, had now become the burial ground of his parents. The smell of blood mixed with the damp air of the basement, creating a stench that would, within days, betray him. When he finally returned to his room, the hammer still in his hand, Michael collapsed onto his bed. He stared at the ceiling once again, but this time the silence felt different. The oppressive control of his parents was gone, replaced by an eerie emptiness. He thought he might feel relief, but instead, a hollow pit grew inside him. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time Michael began to realize the magnitude of what he had done. For the first few days after the night of November 6, 2021, the Rivera home appeared quiet but unremarkable to the outside world. Curtains stayed drawn, the family car remained in the driveway, and no one saw Daniel or Elena at church on Sunday. Their absence raised mild curiosity among fellow parishioners, but most assumed they were ill or traveling. Michael, however, stayed inside, avoiding all unnecessary contact. He kept his phone on silent, ignoring texts and calls from relatives who were used to hearing from his mother. By November 9th, unease began to spread. The Riveras were deeply embedded in their church community, and missing Sunday service was unusual enough, but missing a midweek Bible study was unheard of. Friends began calling the house, only to receive no answer. Michael, consumed by a fog of fear and paranoia, let the phone ring endlessly. He barely ate, moving between his room and the basement, where the smell of decay had already started to intensify. Neighbors on Oakwood Lane were the first to sense that something was wrong. The Rivera family had always been visible, tending to their yard, waving politely, attending community events. Suddenly the house looked abandoned. By November 11th, a pungent odor drifted from the basement vents, noticeable even from the sidewalk. At first, some neighbors assumed it was a dead animal beneath the house, but within a day the smell grew stronger, unmistakable in its foulness. That evening, one neighbor, Patricia Morgan, who lived directly across the street, finally called the police. She reported the odor, mentioning her concern that she hadn't seen Daniel or Elena in nearly a week. Officers from the San Antonio Police Department were dispatched to the home on the evening of November 12, 2021, around 7:45 p.m. When officers knocked on the door, Michael answered, his appearance disheveled. His hair was unkempt, dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his clothes looked as though he had been wearing them for days. The officers noted his nervous demeanor almost immediately. When asked about his parents, Michael claimed they were visiting relatives in Dallas. His explanation was short, his tone flat, and he avoided eye contact. The officers left after a brief conversation, but suspicions lingered. Protocol required a follow-up. The next morning, a detective unit returned, this time requesting to enter the home. Michael hesitated before stepping aside. As soon as the door opened, the stench became overpowering. The detectives exchanged silent glances. This was not the smell of an empty house. It was something far worse. Inside, the house looked oddly frozen. Plates from a previous meal still sat on the dining table, clothes were folded on the couch, and Bibles lay open on the coffee table. It didn't look like a family who had suddenly left for a trip. As they moved cautiously through the home, one detective noticed a trail of faint reddish stains on the hallway carpet leading toward the basement door. When they opened the basement door, the smell intensified. With flashlights cutting through the darkness, the detectives descended the steps. At the bottom, partially covered by blankets and plastic sheeting, lay the bodies of Daniel and Elena Rivera. The discovery was gruesome, blunt force trauma was evident, and the hammer, still stained, lay discarded nearby. Michael, who had been standing silently in the living room upstairs, was immediately placed in custody. He offered no resistance, no explanation. Officers later recalled that he seemed almost detached, staring blankly as he was handcuffed. By November 13, 2021, news of the Rivera tragedy spread quickly through San Antonio. Local news outlets reported the shocking discovery, emphasizing the family's religious reputation and deep ties to the church. The image of the Rivera family as a pillar of faith clashed violently with the grim reality uncovered in their basement. Detectives began piecing together a timeline. Neighbors were interviewed, recounting the sudden silence of the household and the odor that had prompted the call. Friends from church described the family as devout and close-knit, though some admitted they had noticed Michael's distance in recent months. At school, teachers recalled his withdrawn behavior, while a handful of classmates mentioned his resentment toward his parents' strict rules. Back at the police station, Michael was questioned for hours. At first, he denied any involvement, repeating the story that his parents had traveled to Dallas. But confronted with the evidence in the basement, his composure cracked. He confessed in a halting voice, describing the night of November 6th in fragmented detail. He admitted to striking his parents while they slept, dragging them to the basement and covering their bodies. His tone was flat, devoid of the emotional weight one might expect in such a confession. Investigators noted his unusual demeanor. He expressed no clear remorse, only a detached acknowledgement of what he had done. When asked why, his answer was chillingly simple: "They wouldn't let me live my own life." The case quickly became one of the most talked about crimes in the city. The combination of religious devotion, family reputation, and the brutality of the act drew national attention. Reporters camped outside the Rivera home, capturing images of police tape stretched across the yard and neighbors standing in shock. Meanwhile, the church community grappled with disbelief. Daniel and Elena had been respected leaders, considered models of faith and discipline. The idea that their only son could turn against them in such a violent way was almost incomprehensible. Congregants gathered in prayer circles, mourning the couple while struggling to reconcile their image of Michael with the brutal reality. The early stages of the investigation laid bare a tragedy rooted not in sudden impulse alone, but in years of simmering conflict. Detectives, journalists, and neighbors alike began asking the same question: what could drive a 19-year-old to such extremes against the very people who raised him? As investigators dug deeper into the Rivera case in mid-November 2021, the narrative that initially seemed straightforward, an angry teenager lashing out against strict parents, began to reveal unsettling complexities. At first, police and the public assumed the murder was solely the result of household tension and religious pressure. But as detectives reviewed Michael's digital footprint, journals, and private conversations, they uncovered layers of planning and intent that painted a far darker picture. Michael's confession during the initial interrogation had been almost mechanical. He spoke of being controlled, of feeling suffocated, and of wanting freedom. But detectives noticed his words lacked detail about the actual moment of violence. Instead, he seemed focused on justifying himself, repeating the same idea: "They wouldn't let me live my life." Something about the detachment unsettled the lead investigator, Detective Carla Jenkins, a veteran of the San Antonio Police Department. She suspected that Michael's decision had not been as sudden as he wanted them to believe. Her instincts proved correct. A forensic sweep of Michael's laptop revealed internet searches dating back months. Keywords like "how to get away with murder," "how long does it take for a body to smell," and "hiding evidence in a basement" were logged as early as August 2021. Even more disturbing were several private notes saved on his phone, written almost like diary entries. One entry from October 23 read, "They'll never stop. I can't breathe in this house. The only way out is to end it. The hammer in the basement could work." These discoveries shifted the narrative from a crime of passion to premeditated murder. Prosecutors, already building their case, realized they would have little trouble proving intent. For investigators, the twist wasn't only in the planning, it was in the extent of Michael's disconnection from reality. He had convinced himself that killing his parents was not just an option, but the only solution. The church community, already shaken by the violent loss of Daniel and Elena, struggled even more when these details emerged in the news. Members who once saw Michael as a quiet, obedient young man now had to confront the fact that he had been harboring violent thoughts for months. Some refused to believe it, insisting the media was exaggerating. Others, however, began quietly admitting they had noticed signs of strain. Michael's absence from youth group, his distant stares during service, his unwillingness to participate in community events. Another layer to the twist came from interviews with extended family. An uncle in Houston revealed to detectives that Michael had once reached out to him in late summer, asking about opportunities to move in and start fresh. The uncle had advised patience, suggesting Michael wait until he turned 21 to make big decisions. Detectives considered this crucial. Michael had potential alternatives. He wasn't as trapped as he claimed. Yet, instead of waiting or seeking legal independence, he chose violence. The autopsy reports added further complexity. While both parents had died from blunt force trauma, the coroner noted defensive wounds on Daniel's arms, suggesting he had awoken and tried to protect himself. This detail contradicted Michael's earlier claim that the attack happened swiftly as they slept. It revealed that at least part of the act had been met with resistance, making the brutality even clearer. Public reaction to these revelations was intense. Local television stations ran nightly updates, and national outlets began covering the case. Headlines painted Michael as both a victim of extreme parental control and a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned his parents' deaths. The duality of the story, religious discipline clashing with youthful rebellion, sparked debates about parenting, mental health, and the line between guidance and control. Detective Jenkins, in a press conference on November 18, 2021, emphasized that while the family's strict environment may have fueled tension, it did not excuse the violence. Many young people struggle with pressure and expectations, she told reporters. But planning and carrying out the murder of your own parents is not an act of desperation, it's an act of choice. Meanwhile, Michael sat in county jail awaiting formal charges. Other inmates reportedly described him as quiet, withdrawn, and often pacing his cell. Guards noted he rarely spoke except when asked direct questions. When a counselor visited him, Michael admitted he felt relieved his parents were gone, but quickly added that he felt nothing at all. His lack of remorse troubled everyone who encountered him. The most shocking twist, however, came when investigators discovered Michael had intended to flee after the murders but never followed through. In his search history were maps to bus stations and cheap motels in Austin. Receipts in his room showed he had withdrawn $300 in cash just 2 days before the killings. Yet, after committing the crime, he never left the house. He stayed eating canned food, ignoring calls, and sitting in the same rooms where his parents had once lived. It was as if his desire for freedom collapsed under the weight of his own actions. This revelation raised chilling questions. Did Michael truly want freedom, or did he simply want destruction? Was the act motivated by escape, or by a darker urge he himself couldn't explain? Detectives debated these questions, but one thing was clear. This was no impulsive attack. It was calculated, prepared, and carried out with chilling intent. By late November, the case had shifted from investigation to preparation for trial. Prosecutors filed charges of capital murder, citing premeditation and brutality. The community, still reeling, waited anxiously for the next stage. But the twist had already been set. What began as a story of a troubled teenager rebelling against strict parents had unfolded into something far darker. A portrait of cold intent wrapped in the face of a 19-year-old who believed killing was his only way forward. By January 2022, the case of Michael Rivera had moved from shock and investigation to the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. The young man who once sat silently in the back pews of his family's church was now seated in an orange jumpsuit behind a defense table, shackled and guarded. The trial drew heavy media attention, with news vans parked outside the courthouse and a steady stream of reporters filling the benches. For the Rivera family's church and neighborhood community, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was the moment when everyone would finally confront the brutal truth of what had happened in that brick house on Oakwood Lane. The prosecution built its case on the foundation of premeditation. They presented Michael's internet search history, his journal entries, and the hammer recovered in the basement. Prosecutor Alan Fletcher, known for his stern demeanor, spoke with unyielding certainty as he laid out the timeline. Weeks of planning, hours of brooding in his room, and the final deliberate choice to take his parents' lives. This was not a moment of lost temper, Fletcher declared to the jury on opening day. This was a calculated act of violence carried out by a young man who wanted freedom at any cost. The defense, however, painted a different picture. Attorney Laura Hernandez argued that Michael had been raised in an environment of extreme control, deprived of independence, and subjected to relentless psychological pressure. She did not deny that Michael killed his parents, but she urged the jury to consider the circumstances that shaped his mind. "This is not a story of cold-blooded murder," she said in her opening statement. "It is the story of a teenager crushed by expectations, isolated from normal life, and driven into a corner with no escape." As testimony unfolded, the courtroom became a stage for the clash between these two narratives. Detectives recounted their discovery of the bodies in the basement, describing the overwhelming stench and the disturbing calm with which Michael was arrested. Forensic experts detailed the injuries sustained by Daniel and Elena, emphasizing the repeated blows consistent with rage and determination. The autopsy photographs, shown briefly, drew gasps from the gallery and tears from members of the Rivera's extended family. One of the most pivotal moments came when the prosecution introduced Michael's October journal entry, "The only way out is to end it. The hammer in the basement could work." Jurors leaned forward as the chilling words were read aloud. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of premeditation undeniable. Fletcher seized the moment, turning to the jury. This was written days before the killings. He didn't act in a moment of fear. He made a plan and he executed it. The defense countered by calling a psychologist, who testified that Michael had shown signs of depression and emotional instability long before the murders. She explained that isolation and strict control could intensify feelings of hopelessness in young people, leading them to irrational and extreme thoughts. The defense hoped to frame Michael not as a monster, but as a product of an environment that gave him no healthy way to cope. Michael himself eventually took the stand. When asked why he killed his parents, he spoke quietly, barely lifting his eyes from the table. "I couldn't breathe in that house," he said. "Every day I felt like I was disappearing. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a project, something they could control. I thought if they were gone, I could finally be free." His words, though soft, carried a chilling detachment. He never once expressed sorrow or remorse. The climax of the trial came during cross-examination. Prosecutor Fletcher pressed Michael on the details of his planning, forcing him to admit that he had searched online for ways to hide bodies and had thought about the hammer days before using it. The exchange grew tense, Fletcher's voice sharp as he drove home the point. "You weren't desperate, Michael. You were deliberate." The young man sat stone-faced, his lack of emotion only reinforcing the prosecution's argument. Outside the courthouse, public opinion was equally divided. Some sympathized with Michael, seeing him as a victim of suffocating control who snapped under pressure. Others condemned him as cold-blooded, a young man who had choices but chose the darkest path. Local talk shows debated the role of strict parenting, while national headlines framed the case as a chilling reminder of hidden family conflicts in seemingly devout households. Inside the courtroom, tension reached its peak when closing arguments began on January 28, 2022. Fletcher's voice thundered as he addressed the jury. Daniel and Elena Rivera devoted their lives to their son, even if their way was strict. They didn't deserve to be bludgeoned in their sleep. This was murder, plain and simple. And justice demands accountability. Defense attorney Hernandez followed, her tone softer but no less urgent. "Michael Rivera is guilty of killing his parents. We cannot change that. But ask yourselves, why did this happen? Was it simply evil, or was it the crushing weight of a life where he had no choices, no freedom, no hope? He is not beyond redemption. Do not let anger alone decide his fate." The jury deliberated for hours, weighing two competing images of Michael Rivera, the calculating killer and the broken son. The air in the courthouse was electric, reporters ready to send out breaking news updates the moment a verdict was reached. Families, church members, and curious onlookers filled the hallways, their whispers echoing through the building. For everyone present, this was more than a verdict. It was the moment where the storm that had begun in a quiet suburban home would reach its violent, decisive conclusion. On the afternoon of January 30, 2022, the jury returned to the courtroom after more than 6 hours of deliberation. The atmosphere was tense, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the 12 men and women who now carried the weight of the Rivera family's fate. Michael sat motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable, his hands resting quietly in front of him. When the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, guilty of capital murder, the silence broke into gasps from the gallery. Some members of the Rivera's extended family wept openly, while others bowed their heads in quiet prayer. Michael showed no outward reaction. He simply stared forward, as if the words had landed in a place too far away for him to feel. During sentencing, the prosecution argued for the maximum penalty, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the months of planning behind it. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing Michael's young age and the oppressive environment that had shaped him. After 2 more days of emotional testimony and argument, the judge sentenced Michael Rivera to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ruling sent shockwaves through the courtroom. For some, it was justice finally served. For others, it was the tragic final chapter of a story that had no winners, only loss. Michael was led away in shackles, his eyes briefly sweeping across the room but never settling on anyone. He left behind not only the physical home on Oakwood Lane but also the shattered remnants of a family and community that had once been bound together by faith. In the weeks that followed, the Rivera house was emptied. Relatives came to pack up belongings, the church community helped clean and restore the property, but the air around it remained heavy. Neighbors admitted they struggled to walk past without remembering the night police arrived, the flashing lights, the tape across the yard. The basement, once an ordinary storage space, had become a symbol of horror few could forget. The church held a memorial for Daniel and Elena in early February. Hundreds attended, filling the pews with flowers, candles, and tears. Speakers remembered the couple's dedication, their faith, and their unwavering service. Yet, beneath the prayers and hymns lingered an unspoken question. How had everything gone so wrong? How had years of guidance and discipline ended with such violence? For the wider community, the case became a cautionary tale about family pressure, mental health, and the dangers of silence. Experts debated whether Michael's actions were born of personal darkness or the crushing weight of his upbringing. But regardless of interpretation, one fact remained clear. 2 lives were gone, and a third was ruined beyond repair. Michael Rivera, once just another teenager struggling under the rules of his home, would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. The story of his crime remained etched in the memory of San Antonio, a chilling reminder that even the most devout families, living in the quietest of neighborhoods, can harbor storms no one sees until it's too late.